Powerful elites try to silence this judge, but his final verdict leaves the courtroom stunned. Judge Malcolm Pierce had spent 20 years upholding the law, believing in its power to deliver justice. But on this day, as he sat behind his bench, his hands tightening around the chair, he knew he was about to make the most dangerous decision of his life. Judge Malcolm Pierce sat behind the towering mahogany bench, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood as he scanned the documents before him. The grandeur of the courtroom, high ceilings, the seal of justice mounted above his head, and the solemn air of authority had always given him a sense of purpose. A purpose he had upheld for over 2 decades. He was known for his impartiality, for his commitment to the law, for being the kind of judge who believed in justice above all else. Yet, as he read through the details of the case before him, an unsettling feeling coiled in his chest. The defendant, Jamal Hayes, 19 years old, no prior criminal record, accused of assaulting Ryan Langston, the son of Gregory Langston, a wealthy businessman with connections reaching deep into the city's political and judicial systems. The prosecution painted Jamal as a violent, out-of-control youth who had lashed out unprovoked. They had no video footage, no credible witnesses, just the word of Ryan and his 2 friends. Yet, the case had already been decided in the court of public opinion. News outlets spun the story as another example of rising street violence. Politicians stood behind podiums, using words like accountability and law and order as they called for swift punishment. Malcolm's eyes flickered toward the jury box. He had seen this pattern before, an overwhelming majority of jurors who had little, if anything, in common with the defendant. Not a single black face among them. The weight of that reality pressed down on him. How is it that cases like these always seem to end up with juries that leaned in one direction? A silent strategy, an invisible force shaping the odds before a word was even spoken in court. The prosecution's opening argument was sharp, almost rehearsed, their voice laced with an underlying certainty, as if they already knew how this trial would end. They painted Jamal as a threat to society, as a young man who had no regard for authority. They spoke of Ryan Langston as a promising college student with a bright future, a victim of senseless aggression. Then came the defense, a young public defender, clearly outmatched and overwhelmed. She did her best to highlight the inconsistencies in the statements made by Ryan and his friends. The alleged assault had taken place in an area with multiple security cameras, yet none of them captured the attack. No physical evidence tied Jamal to the crime. But logic and fairness felt like fragile things in this courtroom. Malcolm's gaze landed on Jamal. The young man sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly together, his expression unreadable. But his eyes held something Malcolm had seen too many times before. Not just fear, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who knew the battle was already lost. It should have been an easy decision. Without solid evidence, this case had no ground to stand on. But Malcolm wasn't naive. He understood the forces at play. A not guilty verdict would draw backlash. Whispers of corruption, of being soft on crime, pressure from figures higher than him. He had seen it happen before. Judges who dare to challenge the system, finding themselves quietly pushed out of their positions. As he sat there, listening to the testimony unfold, Malcolm found himself at war with something he had never truly confronted before. Was justice really blind? Or had it always been guided by unseen hands, moving the scales in one direction? The answer loomed over him like a shadow, heavy and inescapable. The invitation arrived not with fanfare, not with a formal request, but in the form of a discreetly folded note slipped beneath the door of Malcolm's office. A private meeting. The sender? Senator Franklin Donovan. Malcolm wasn't surprised. Donovan was a man whose presence was felt more than seen, a politician whose influence reached into the highest corners of the city. He wasn't just connected to the elite, he was one of them. The kind of man who could bend the law without breaking it, who could shape justice with a mere conversation. Malcolm hesitated before agreeing to the meeting, but he knew he had no choice. Refusing would only raise questions. He arrived at the designated location, a dimly lit lounge in an upscale hotel, the kind of place where secrets were traded over expensive whiskey. The air smelled of leather and aged liquor, the faint hum of a jazz piano drifting through the quiet space. Donovan sat in a private booth, a glass of bourbon in hand, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Malcolm to sit, his movements unhurried, deliberate. Judge Pierce, Donovan greeted smoothly, setting his glass down with a soft clink. You have an important role in this city. People look up to you. Malcolm met the senator's gaze, already sensing the weight behind his words. I try to do my job fairly. Donovan nodded, as if amused. Fairness is a noble ideal. But the world doesn't work in ideals. It works in reality. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make the air feel heavier. And in reality, we all have responsibilities beyond ourselves. Malcolm exhaled slowly. If this is about the Hayes case, it is, Donovan interrupted, his tone as smooth as silk, yet firm as iron. You're a smart man. You see what's happening out there. The city is on edge. People want stability, a strong message. Convicting Jamal Hayes gives them that. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it shift like molten gold. Tough justice keeps the streets safe. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Justice isn't about messages, Senator. It's about truth. Donovan sighed, shaking his head as if Malcolm were a stubborn child refusing to listen. Come now, don't be naive. You know how this works. He paused, letting the silence stretch between them before continuing, his voice lowering to a near whisper. Going against the current can be dangerous. Careers have crumbled. Reputations ruined. Even families have suffered. The words hung in the air like a slow-moving storm. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. A subtle one, wrapped in diplomacy, but a threat nonetheless. Malcolm held his ground, but deep down, a chill crawled up his spine. He had been on the bench long enough to know how these things played out. He had seen promising legal minds disappear overnight, their careers quietly dismantled because they refused to play the game. As he left the lounge, his thoughts swirled in conflict. The pressure was mounting, pressing in from all sides. He had always believed in the law, in its ability to serve justice. But now, he was beginning to realize something far more sinister. The law didn't serve justice. It served power. When Malcolm returned to his office late that evening, he found something unexpected waiting for him. A thick, unmarked envelope sat atop his desk. No note, no explanation. Just a collection of files, bound together with aged paper clips. He hesitated before opening it, his instincts screaming that whatever was inside would change everything. Slowly, he flipped through the first few pages. Court transcripts, sentencing records, case files. And then he saw the pattern. Black men, dozens of them, young like Jamal, unfairly sentenced. Cases built on flimsy evidence. Prosecutors pushing for maximum penalties without cause. Judges handing down rulings that made no sense, unless they were following an invisible script. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat as he realized many of these convictions had been overseen by his predecessor, Judge Harold Whitmore, a man once praised for his tough-on-crime stance, a man who had built a career on statistics that painted him as a champion of justice, while in reality, he had been sentencing innocent men to prison without a second thought. And now, Malcolm was being expected to follow in those same footsteps. The weight of it all pressed down on him as he flipped through more cases. Some were eerily similar to Jamal's. Young men convicted based on the word of people with power, with no physical evidence to support the claims against them. Others have been sentenced under laws designed to disproportionately harm black communities. This wasn't just a flaw in the system. It was the system. By the time Malcolm closed the last file, the night had deepened, the silence in his study almost suffocating. His fingers trembled as he rubbed his temples. He had spent his career believing he could be different, that he could be the kind of judge who truly upheld justice. But now, staring at the undeniable truth, he felt the walls closing in around him. Could he truly fight against something this entrenched? Or was the system too big, too powerful, too untouchable? Malcolm had always believed he was the one holding the gavel. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the weight of the files. He spent nights in his study, poring over the cases, tracing patterns that should have never existed. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Young black men, accused and convicted on evidence that barely held together. Prosecutors who built careers on exaggerated charges. Judges who had quiet connections to political figures like Donovan. It wasn't random. It was intentional. The deeper Malcolm went, the more disturbed he became. The convictions were not just mistakes. They were systemic choices, patterns woven into the legal fabric of the city. Judges who handed down the harshest sentences received promotions. Prosecutors who ensured convictions found their careers fast-tracked. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed. But Malcolm needed more. Through old records and quiet inquiries, he tracked down Arthur Bell, a former court clerk who had mysteriously resigned years ago. Arthur had been close to the inner workings of the judicial process, until one day, he vanished from the legal scene. No explanation. Just gone. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people mind their business. Arthur sat in a back booth, his hands shaking slightly as he stirred his coffee. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted. I knew someone would come looking eventually. Arthur muttered as Malcolm slid into the seat across from him. What happened? Malcolm asked, keeping his voice low. Arthur exhaled sharply. You want the truth, Judge? Judges don't just make decisions. Some are guided. He rubbed his temple as if the memories pained him. There are favors, incentives, some of them financial, some of them less obvious. Those who play along rise. Those who don't. He trailed off, staring into his coffee like it held the answers he had spent years trying to forget. Malcolm leaned forward. Arthur, I need to know. Who's behind this? Arthur hesitated before whispering. The same people who put you on that bench. A chill ran through Malcolm's spine. The conversation ended abruptly when Arthur glanced over Malcolm's shoulder and paled. You shouldn't have come here. That was the last time Malcolm saw Arthur alive. Days later, news broke that Arthur Bell had been found dead in his small apartment. Official cause, an overdose. Malcolm knew better. Then, the warning started. Colleagues who once greeted him with warmth now avoided his gaze. Court staff whispered when he walked by, their voices dying the moment he entered a room. His secretary, normally friendly, acted nervous around him. He was being isolated, marked. And then came the real message. One evening, as Malcolm returned home, he found his garage door defaced in bold, red spray paint. Stay in line. His gut clenched. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a final warning. Later that night, as Malcolm stepped onto his porch, a rustling sound made his instincts flare. He ducked just as a gunshot shattered his porch light. Heart hammering, he scrambled back inside, locking the door behind him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Someone wanted him dead, and they weren't going to stop. Jamal's trial began under a cloud of tension. Malcolm observed every detail, every inconsistency in the prosecution's case. The key witness, Ryan Langston's friend, kept contradicting himself under cross-examination. The police report contained glaring errors, details that should have been addressed before the case ever made it to court. Yet, the jury had been carefully selected, each member either connected to figures like Donovan or to institutions that benefited from maintaining the status quo. The verdict felt predetermined. At home, Vanessa confronted him. You're pushing too hard, she whispered, her eyes filled with fear. Think about our family, Malcolm. You have to stop. Malcolm held her hands tightly. If I stop, then I become part of it. I can't do that, she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. I just don't want to lose you. Neither of them knew how close that loss already was. That night, Malcolm reached out to Sarah Lawson, an investigative journalist who had spent years trying to expose corruption within the legal system. They met in an underground parking lot, speaking in hushed voices. You're not just dealing with bias, Judge, she warned. This is deeper. This system is built on corruption, and the people behind it don't like anyone messing with it. Hours later, Malcolm was driving home when he felt it. The steering was off. His car lurched violently, skidding across the road. He barely managed to regain control before crashing. Later, the mechanic confirmed his worst fear. His brakes had been tampered with. Then, the attack came. Sitting in his office late at night, he noticed a flickering light. The air felt different. He turned just as a masked figure lunged at him, a blade flashing. Malcolm fought back, dodging the initial attack, struggling against the assailant. Papers flew off his desk. A picture frame shattered. With a last desperate effort, he knocked the attacker back. The figure slipped away into the shadows, but not before whispering a final warning. Drop the case. Malcolm knew now He was being watched. His phone calls had strange echoes. His office had been searched. And suddenly, the media was turning on him. Articles surfaced questioning his past rulings, painting him as a biased judge with an agenda. The system was working to erase him. Then came the final meeting with Donovan. This time, the senator's usual charm was gone. His voice was hard, his gaze piercing. You have a choice, Judge Pierce. Convict Jamal, and everything stays as it is. Fight this, and you'll lose everything. Malcolm met his stare. Some things are worth losing everything for. That night, the final warning arrived. An anonymous message flashed across his phone. You're running out of time. Then his house alarm blared. Rushing to the window, he saw two men in dark suits approaching. Vanessa screamed as the power cut out. Malcolm grabbed his gun, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The men broke in. The fight was brutal. Fists, gunfire, broken furniture. He took one attacker down, but the other managed to escape. Breathing heavily, Malcolm stood in the wreckage of his home. Blood dripped from a cut on his temple. Vanessa sobbed, clutching their son. Next day, the courtroom was packed as Malcolm prepared to deliver the verdict. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady. This case has shown me that justice is not just about laws. It's about the people who uphold them. But when the system is manipulated, justice is lost. He announced Jamal's release. The room erupted. The media exploded with coverage. That night, he received notice. He was suspended, pending an ethics investigation. As Malcolm walked out of the courthouse, a black car idled nearby. The window rolled down just enough for him to see Donovan's cold smile. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning.